Daniel Geer is one of the most thought-provoking and respected speakers and writers in the cybersecurity world. He played a key role in the development of X Windows and Kerberos, has been an entrepreneur 6 times, and testified before Congress 5 times. Dan is now in government service at In-Q-Tel, the investment arm of the U.S. intelligence community. Please welcome Dan Geer and Dale Peterson to the S4 Main Stage.
So this is really exciting for me to be able to interview Dan on stage here, and actually you're one of the easier people to interview because you've spoken and written so much, and you tend to put down your speeches verbatim, so it's easy to come up with a lot of questions, and the challenge is going to be covering a lot of ground in 30 minutes. So why don't we begin with the concept of understanding and managing risk, because you've talked a lot about that. And I'd like to start with the concept of dependencies. Two of the things that really caught my attention was you said complexity ensures underappreciated mutual dependence. And then you also said if dependencies are not estimable, then they will be underestimated. So maybe if you could let the audience know how you came to those thoughts, why you believe that to be true, and if at all, how that would apply to ICS, to someone who maybe is running a refinery or a manufacturing plant.
One, thank you for the introduction. The question you ask is perhaps the hardest question that we face, actually, which is how do you avoid cascade or otherwise cascade failure or otherwise correlated failure. And it seems as if every time we make a radical change in the technology environment, we extinguish some such problems and we create some others. The underestimation point that I've made that you brought up, which is in a way the heart, at least for me, let me just parenthetic remark. Everybody my age was trained for something else, so I'm a retread, okay? Because everybody my age was. I was actually trained as a statistician, so to a degree I think in those terms. And the way that shows up here is that a function that has a loss that can occur under an unlikely circumstance, but when it is, it's a large loss, is the very thing that we care about the most. And the way in which it seems that we have failure in our world is sort of comes down to this. In most physical systems, redundancy is a protection against failure. Redundancy says that a random fault here will not propagate to there. But when you're facing sentient opponents, redundancy actually increases risk, it doesn't decrease it. Because that just means that whatever tool they use to bring this one down will also work here and here and here. And it is the trade-off between, on the one hand, what you think your probabilities are of random faults, versus on the other hand, what you think your probabilities are of targeted faults. Barabasi years ago in the, well, I'll say the popular book Linked, but there were a number of papers he wrote as well, talked about how it is not possible to design a network that is at the same time optimally resistant to random faults and optimally resistant to targeted faults, that you have to trade off one for the other. And this redundancy point is along the same lines, that the degree to which common mode failure is possible is in a way one kind of bound on what the future might hold. The degree to which random faults are probable, for example, such as working under, the hot sun and the mud and, on and on, all the things that can go wrong, is another. And when we have systems that depend on each other in ways that on a day-to-day basis we do not see them, when they work well, you don't see that. estimating that over time is, I think, actually critically difficult, and yet at the same time, back to your question, which I'm probably answering at too great a length, it is the heart of this. How do you know that dependencies in and amongst these things result in an increase in the probability of a targeted fault, even though they may have decreased the probability of suffering a random fault? It is a core trade-off.
It was interesting as you were explaining that, the trade-off between the random fault and, let's say a human caused intentional fault, in a cyber attack. The probabilities today are still higher for a random fault, but you could have cases where the impact is much greater for a targeted fault. So where a human being actually causes a cyber attack. So
Sure.
it becomes a tough decision whether the redundancy helping you or not, or do you need redundancy plus, or what do you look at?
I'm afraid I'm not going to give you
You're not going to solve the problem?
I'm not going to solve the problem here on stage. I'm sorry. But let me just remind us all that what sets us apart from most other engineering disciplines, which I will call this an engineering discipline for the moment, is that we have sentient opponents. The bridge designer, the newspaper man, on and on, doesn't really, as a rule, have sentient opponents. And that's what makes the difference here, is trying to decide what we're now calling the random versus the targeted. Because the sentient opponent not only will pick the best target, but will mutate as required.
Well, then, I pulled out those two quotes, but then the next one gets a little depressing, because if it's so hard to understand these dependencies, you've written that bounding dependence is the core of rational risk management. So
I believe that to be true.
So how do we get to rational risk management if we're bad at bounding dependencies? Do we?
I don't think that's impossible. I think it's a matter of, we in this field need a construct much like in, say, civil engineering, where they talk about a margin of safety.
Okay.
This bridge is supposed to take 20-ton trucks. We'll design it to take 60. As long as things continue, as long as this bridge gets used within its design envelope, there's no issue. Just no issue. Of course, we have a hard time with that part of what I just said, of keeping things within their design envelope. We have a hard time with that. But we need something like a margin of safety calculation. What I was getting at in the passage you quote is that because we will tend to accumulate dependencies which are not obvious to the human inspector. I quit, you get hired, you quit, someone else gets hired. How do they know that these things are low down? They don't necessarily. Everyone will remember, I'm sure, the episode where a plane that took off from Rio de Janeiro never made it to Paris. It went down in the ocean. And it went down in the ocean because the operators were seeing operational modes that they didn't know to expect. In this case, if you put the nose of the plane up, it screams at you, you're going to stall. If you put the nose of the plane up even higher, it stops screaming at you, because it assumes that whatever it was using as a data input must have failed, because you can't be actually like this. So if you now put the nose down, it starts screaming about stalling again. That destroyed the ability of the pilots in question to make good decisions. It's that kind of hidden dependency, if you want to call it that, that I think when we design things, we ought to how shall I put this? I think the paragon of security design is the absence of silent failure. Because silent failure means that something is correcting for it and you don't know it. Suppose you have a redundant system where 3 out of 5 have to work. One fails. Everything's still great. But if it didn't tell you that it failed, you don't realize now that you're in a 3 of 4 situation. Another one fails. It's still operational. if it didn't tell you that it failed, you don't know now that you have no protection against the failure of one more component, because now, what do you mean I don't have 3? I have 3 of 5. No, no, no. You were down to 3 of 3 and you didn't know. It's that I'm getting at. It's not allowing yourself, by design, to get into a circumstance where whatever your, I'll use it again, margin of safety is violated. The absence, just do not allow silent failure. I would prefer to know when something has failed. I would prefer, in fact, I would be willing to raise the probability of failure a little bit. I don't know quite how much, we'll have to debate that, to ensure that I don't have a silent failure. Because silent failures are where the hidden dependencies lurk, actually.
Well, and silent failures are a challenge to this industry and the people in this room, because the attackers are getting smarter in the sense that if they can hide the alert that there is a failure, they can go on much more. So we're facing that.
The previous speaker is a friend of mine. He knows more about that particular topic than anybody I know. But yeah, that's the idea. It's how do you protect against, in that case, not only the intentional failure, but the intentional degradation of the signal that failure had occurred.
Yeah.
Well, I would not recommend that any of you necessarily say that in every case of a design question that comes before me, I start with the what would a nation state do? You know, that's a different problem than I hope any of you face on a regular basis. But it illustrates, I mean, the extremes always illustrate something. Yep. The extremes always illustrate something. But I do think the paragon of security design is no silent failure.
Okay.
Just as I think that the state of security, if you've achieved security, if you're in a state of security, it is that there are no surprises that can't be mitigated. Which goes back to, well, I need to hear things before they are giant surprises. I need to hear them when they're little.
We have a class of attack that's called HILF attacks, high impact, low frequency. That really, especially for the more critical infrastructure ICS people in the audience and the vendors that support them, they're struggling to deal with, as is governments and regulators and everyone else, where, you know, a lot of cases, as we had Richard Clark on stage last year talking about his Cassandra book, these are oftentimes things that have never happened. So the frequency today is 0, but maybe, you know, maybe it will be low for a long time. It's really a challenge when you have no data on that, and yet the consequence could be very large. And one of the real, I think, issues that we're struggling with as a community is, what do you do in the case where a business decides that the risk is acceptable, whether it's proper or not? Maybe they're underestimating the likelihood, but they say, we're willing to live with this high consequence event that we believe is an extremely low possibility, but society might not be willing to live with that if that were to happen, a nation state might say, or even a region might say, we should spend a lot more money just in case that happens. How do you deal with the whole business rationale versus societal?
Well, I think that risk acceptance, you know, sign here to accept risk, is a necessary component, but it is not sufficient. It's necessary in the sense that if someone doesn't have some skin in the game, they're not going to take it seriously. On the other hand, how shall I put this? Everyone in this room has signed dozens of end-user license agreements that they haven't read. So the necessary but sufficient quality of having a risk acceptance, I think, is unarguable. The question then is, as you say, the high probability, low frequency. This is where redundancy of a different sort comes in. Not redundancy in the sense of I need 500 of these transformers in storage at all times just in case somebody shoots one of them in the field. I don't mean that kind of redundancy. I mean a different kind where there's more than one mechanism that allows you to operate the thing which is critical. We were talking about this earlier. I'll use my favorite example. In the Y2K episode, for those of you who are old enough to remember that, the head of the water department in New York City said, "We're not going to have any problem. We've got valves and we know where they are." And the point of that was he did not share a common mode failure with the people who made elevators. I'm not picking on any of you who actually make elevators, by the way. The idea that there is how do you stop a forest fire? There are two ways. One, you burn down it, you start a backfire, and the other is you bulldoze some stuff. Either way, what you're doing is you're trying to make an area where transmission cannot occur. All I'm getting at here, and this goes back to the hidden dependencies, is you've got to have some circumstance in which a problem here does not spread to a problem there. So when I say a different sense of the word redundancy, I mean two mechanisms, not two devices that are programmed the same, but two mechanisms that do not share any common mode failure so far as you can ascertain. And it's that I think for the critical infrastructures, I think it's that we need, is some sense that propagation of an ongoing forest fire or analogy will not cross this boundary of, no, that can't do this. It can't do this. We've already burned all the firewood, or we've already, taken care of that. That isn't the kind of thing that your average, let's say, CFO is going to understand. They're going to say, well, how many of those do you need to operate? They're not going to understand why do you need an entirely different second investment in what we already know how to do. They're not going to understand that. That's where, we all come in.
And the people that have been around for decades in the audience probably remember the days when you could move to manual operations. I know that's still in a lot of plans, but it's a pipe dream for a lot of those plans today, but where you actually had enough people with the right knowledge that you could move to manual operations. So that avoids, or could avoid.
Yeah, I'm going to say something nice to all of you who are older. In 2003, I think it was, I used to work in the medical world. The Beth Israel Hospital in Boston, which is a Harvard teaching hospital and a big deal, did an upgrade to their mainframe system, and it didn't work, and they couldn't back it out. And so for 4 days, they had to revert to paper.
Yeah.
The doctors who were over the age of 50 thought there was nothing to it. Oh, lab sheets, sure. The doctors under the age of 50 had a lot of problems.
I can appreciate that being over 50.
But it's a natural experiment. In a sense, things like that, things like the stuff that was referred to in your speech earlier, things like the ongoing meltdown inspector vulnerabilities in CPUs. Again, I'm going to think like a biostatistician for a second. Those are natural experiments, and we should mine them for everything we can. We should mine them for everything we can. We don't say, that'll never happen here, I can't think about that, blah, blah. No, these are important, because you couldn't schedule such a thing. You couldn't get anybody to agree to try such a thing. It's on and on and on. The natural experiments are the ones which have the most telling conclusions if you work at it. Of course, Spectre may well be something that you can, that vulnerability may be exercisable without leaving forensic trace, which is another issue, but you get what I'm driving at.
I do, and I think in our industry, the example, the 2015 Ukraine power outage was a great example. Everyone focused on the attack code and that, but the recovery capability was very interesting, and whether that was capable by U.S. and other nations' utilities is an open question that some people disagree on.
Well, those natural, to use the Ukraine folks as a natural experiment, somebody no doubt thought of that as A, it's immediately useful, and B, we will learn something about could we do this elsewhere.
Yeah. So I guess just before we leave this thread, so going to the second non-redundant means without the common mode failures of manual is well understood. Do you think it's possible to have something, if you forgive the word, like a second cyber system, something susceptible to cyber attack that is different than the first one? Is that practical, or is that just kidding ourselves?
No, I think it's possible. There's an area of research about which I know little. But for machine learning in particular, it has now been demonstrated several different ways, both in academia and not, that attack on the data stream that is going into a machine learning situation, of course, produces results you didn't think would happen. There's the term of art, if you want to search for the academic research literature, which again is as yet small, is adversarial learning. And I think someone uses a slightly different term instead of learning, but the idea is adversarial training, that you'll have the same data set, but you'll start two different machine learning systems that are intentionally off kilter in some way, and see whether both of them converge to the same solution, or do they converge to different solutions. This is the problem mountain climbers have. You climb up a mountain, you think to yourself, am I on the tallest peak, or is it the next one? You know, how do I know I'm on the right peak? I think this past year there was someone climbed Everest, except they didn't. It's that kind of thing. Yeah. What I'm suggesting is that if we're going to rely on machine learned algorithms, then perhaps we should have several of them. And if they don't converge, we know something about the data stream that they're using, or our algorithms, or both. If they don't converge, I think you have a real issue.
And I would think that if you had a second cyber system, it would not necessarily have to have all the features and functions, the bells and whistles as the first one, so it's not necessarily double the cost.
Not necessarily.
If done right.
Not necessarily. All in all, computing is cheap. Yeah. Data is expensive. I think that I just did a piece that is about to appear, so I'm spoiling it, but I think going forward, what had heretofore been in the classic security triad of confidentiality, integrity, availability, where in the broadest sense, confidentiality had been the first amongst equals. I think in the data and machine learning and, quote, AI, unquote, world, it'll be integrity, not confidentiality. The number of sensors is such that the confidentiality question is mooted. But if I want to derail somebody, I send them false data. Yeah. And particularly if the algorithms that are produced by machine learning are not ones that you can then interrogate as to, well, why did you make that decision? If I'm going to rely on an algorithm, I want to be able to query it in some useful way. Why did you make that decision? Even if it's not a why that I liked, why did my self-driving car kill me? The answer is because there were 15 people on the sidewalk. I don't really like that answer, but then again, it is an answer. Yeah. It is an answer.
It's funny when you say that, I was thinking, they're going from CIA ranked order to putting integrity higher. This is one of the SCADASEC 101 things, that it's typically AIC in our world, but
sure.
Again, the integrity is also moving up higher.
Well,
now
I do realize
that.
That in the world that I believe you inhabit, that availability was the first among equals. I understand that. I'm just saying that perhaps we share something with those who are doing, say, financial decisions. I'm just making that up. That integrity is becoming a bigger deal.
It is, yeah. I think our sectors, over the last couple of years, has realized that, that is almost as important as availability. Mm-hmm. So let's talk. There's one other thing I think the audience will find fascinating. You picked up some of Bruce Schneier's writings and expanded on them with this idea of the value of patching systems. Mm-hmm. And you talk about the value of patching systems is based on the density of vulnerabilities in the systems. Mm-hmm. So if a system has dense vulnerabilities, maybe just briefly describe what you mean by that, what would you recommend?
Sure. Well, for everybody who hadn't read what he's read, the argument is very simple. Schneier asked the question, are vulnerabilities dense or sparse? And I've asked that question of a number of pretty smart people over time, and I get an array of answers that tells you we don't have an answer. They're good and smart and careful people who say they are sparse, and complete that sentence again, who say they are dense. There are strong opinions in both directions. With the Cybersecurity Grand Challenge, which took place at DEF CON in August of 16, where finding vulnerabilities was completely hands-off. This was a capture the flag episode with robotic. It along the same line said, if I can find vulnerabilities with an automatic process, that only adds to the strength of this question of are they dense or are they sparse? It adds to the strength of that question. Well, here's what a statistician would say. If they are dense, that means in any given body of code, there are many of them. If there are enough of them that your ability to patch a significant fraction is limited, let's say there's 6,000, you patch one, that didn't make a whole lot of difference. If there are 15, you patch one, it did make a whole lot of difference. It's just the ratio. By the way, people like me like to look at ratios of things because they tend to magnify underlying effects. Okay, so that's all I'm doing here is saying 1 out of 6,000 is one thing, 1 out of 15 is another. The 1 out of 15, I would do. And if you look at, for example, the history of a particular operating system, in this case FreeBSD, or you look at, there was a wonderful paper quite a while ago by Osment and Schechter, the title of which is Milk or Wine. And the idea was, well, milk doesn't age well, wine does. And so if you have a body of code under competent management, does it slowly cleanse itself of vulnerabilities or does it not? And that was the question they asked, and they had some good data. All I was getting at with that is that from an economic perspective, if there are a bajillion vulnerabilities, or you want to assume as a matter of prudence that there are a bajillion vulnerabilities, then perhaps spending all of your treasure on reducing vulnerabilities is not wise. Spending a significant portion of that treasure on reducing increasing your ability to respond to the system should those vulnerabilities be exercised. And that's, you know, when you get a penetration testing, what makes a good pen tester stand out is not we broke it or we couldn't break it. That's not interesting. Everything can be broken. I think it's conservative to assume that everything can be broken with enough effort. So the best pen tester is the one whose estimate of the level of effort required to break is the most believable. This would take blah, 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 blah. And then you ask yourself, do I have any enemies prepared to spend that? And so that comes to this density versus sparseness. My guess is that artificial intelligence in the long run will show us that they are denser than we thought, and hence will enhance the seeming wisdom of those who spent more on detection and mitigation than they spent on repair. On the other hand, the idea of automatic update may make what I just said false. So long as, of course, no one ever takes over your automatic update scheme. That's game over in every real sense. And there has been one of those. There has been one public episode of that kind of thing in Europe, as I recall.
I'm kind of curious, though. So again, I may be falling into the trap of treating this community like a special little flower, but in some ways it is a little different in that we know. And again, I don't want to throw all the vendors under the bus.
Hey, it's warm. The lights are on. There's your community. I mean, you know, let's.
Yeah. So I mean, so some vendors have had a security development life cycle for 5 or more years. They're beginning to get a handle on their code. You could argue the vulnerabilities are not dense, but in our community, there are certain sectors and certain classes of equipment where there's no question the vulnerabilities are dense. We could look at like medical devices. Mm-hmm. You know, so if we were to take that as an example class where we know the vulnerabilities are dense in medical devices, yet FDA is really pushing towards anytime something comes out that the vendor has to issue this, there has to be a recall, they have to do this, they have to patch it. Based on what you're saying, that doesn't sound like an efficient or effective approach. what would you do for something like that medical device problem?
The medical device one's an interesting question. In particular,
Yeah.
There was a workshop 2 years ago, a year ago. Sorry, I'm getting old. Carl Landwehr, who used to run the cyber grant side of National Science Foundation, called this along with Kevin Fu at University of Michigan. And the question was, what would a building code, just like this building, what would a building code for medical devices look like? And if you wanted to read some interesting stuff, go and follow that, the idea of what would a building code for medical devices look like. I do know that the biggest program, supposedly the biggest program to date that has been proved correct, and I mean proved in the mathematician sense, was a quadcopter control program done by Kathleen Fisher at Northeastern as a DARPA program manager. I do know also that Sandy Clark, who is at UPenn, has shown that if you change your code base often enough, underline often enough, and we'll come back to that, you can throw off a certain class of attackers because they have to learn how your code works. And if you've changed it by the time they figure it out, they lose. She refers to this as the honeymoon effect.
Okay.
The honeymoon effect. And it may well be that the Google Chrome people are doing that because they do, what, 2 releases? All these rapid release people may be getting a little benefit as a side effect of the rapid release. So I say we are sort of at a fork in the road. Down that path says proof of correctness. It isn't easy. Once we've done it, then we have brutal change control. This one says thrash your code all the time, and sure, every time you do it, you're going to introduce new vulnerabilities, but they won't be exercised by the time that they've been overwritten by something else. Now, Sandy's remarks, by the way, include, and don't use the same libraries either, so there's a little bit of an interesting issue here. But I think that is a fork in the road, and both those have good academics standing behind them and real results. And here's the only thing that strikes me about that. If you take one path, you can't later go to the other. So you have to make a choice. Are you going to go in the direction with medical devices or with things in the critical infrastructure that we are going to do proof of correctness, and then we're going to be careful about change? Or are we going to do this, let's conservatively assume that we have attackers waiting at all times, waiting for us to make mistakes, and we just make sure that by the time they figure out what mistakes we've made new ones. Interesting trade-off.
Yeah, it is. I think we need a catchy title like security by obscurity. You need like security by morphology.
Security by obscurity might be something where if you have enough obscurity, I know a couple of financial institutions which do not want their names used, but you would recognize them, who have committed to writing their own code. With the argument that if we write our own code and we do not release it, then there is a measure of obscurity-fueled security. Now, mind you, in a circumstance such as that, what you're basically saying is, I can't make it safe, but I can't keep you from stealing my car if you really want it badly enough, but I can make his more attractive. I win.
Well, that's great, Dan. I really appreciate you coming down to S4 and agreeing to an on-stage interview, and I'm sure you'll be around for some of the people to talk to. So thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you.